We'll be live in 10 seconds.
Okay, right, we're on. So welcome to Array Talkback. We're here with most of the artists featuring Array and sort of half the creative team. We've got Dan Potter, Dan Samsa, Atal Tanaka, Luke David Harris, Kamikaze Space Program, Simon Deacon, Alex Reeve, Uta Kogelsberger, Imogen Williams and Struan Leslie. I won't go into exactly who does what, we'll do that as we go around. I'm just going to give you a bit of background about the project, this iteration of it and a previous iteration. So it started maybe a few years ago when Dan came to me and asked if I'd like to spatialize an album of his for a live music experience. So I run an immersive audio outfit called Call and Response. We've got a 27.2 channel studio. We're based at Somerset House now. We were at Deptford then. And we curate and produce immersive audio experiences. So anything from theatre to live music and sound arts. More recently, we've been interested in working with live musicians. So previously everything was playback. And this is how this kind of came about. So Dan and I worked in the studio quite closely to unpack an album that was complete and then re-spatialize everything for a live experience. So we brought in live musicians, and I'm going to go over to Dan now if he wants to talk a little bit about that process and how you how you started to reimagine your album as you unpacked it and then started to kind of replace the programmed or recorded elements with live musicians.
Yeah, well, basically, I guess it came about because I finished this album and was thinking, you know, how do you present an album so it's just not just kind of your mum and dad listening to it and a couple of mates that feel sorry for you. And it was also at the same time that, you know, it's about 3 years ago when there was a bit of a buzz around these new kind of VR technologies. So I had to go on a couple of mates' sort of VR sets and just kind of made me think about kind of, you know, moving sounds around in a sort of 3D space and then realizing that Tom, who had a studio on my street with a 360 sound studio. So me and Tom went to Goldsmiths together and did the studio composition course. So that's how I knew him originally. And yeah, got in touch with him, as he said. And then, yeah, so then we got in the studio together and yeah, it's kind of, everything was sort of already recorded and mixed. And it kind of consisted of drum machine parts, live strings, vocals, piano, synth, a couple of other sort of sound effects as well. And yeah, so then we got into the studio and we sort of planned the gig and kind of deciding what we were able to do live and to what extent kind of the spatialized parts could then also be sort of performed live as well, which was kind of at the time quite limited because of computer sort of processing power. But yeah, so then we got in the studio and we started mixing the stems. Quite a lot of them were in stereo, which was quite nice, sort of using the blue ripple stereo panners to sort of move things around. And because a lot of the parts already had sort of quite nice stereo effects on them, that sort of just gave us a bit more kind of scope to sort of create really cool spatial effects. And yeah, then then we eventually performed it live in the Albany, and we had sort of strings playing live over the top and live piano and synth parts. And some of the drums were sort of triggered live. But yeah, so it's quite slow at first, kind of deciding where we would sort of put things within the 3D space, how we'd move things around. You know, I kind of got quite excited wanting to sort of spin everything around at first. And then once we got bored of that, kind of just carefully placing things within the space. And then we got into a bit of a rhythm with it. And each track we kind of developed a sort of process for each track. You know, make the kick drum was kind of sitting central, quite low down, and it's amazing being able to work with not just kind of, you know, we're used to working in stereo, so we can pan things, you know, to either side and move them around, and obviously we're working, you know, in a sort of more sort of circle this time, but also having the vertical as well. So being able to place kind of kick drums low down, and then sort of maybe hi-hats and some high, you know, really high pitched sort of sounds right at the top in the roof, was just really exciting. So yeah, it was we kind of developed a sort of process where certain things in each track would kind of, you know, stay central in the same place, and then other stuff, you know, we're like, yeah, we can definitely sort of move that stuff around and place that up in the ceiling.
Yeah, and I'd say, I don't know what you feel, Dan, but I think the studio part of the process kind of felt relatively natural and easy. It was, the big challenge was transferring that spatial mix from the studio to the bigger space. So it took place at the Albany, so we had to redesign the speaker array to fit in a space that was sort of 4 times the size of the studio. But one of the things that I don't think we had the kind of experience or headspace time to really think about was the relationship between the live musicians that we brought in and the audience. So what we did was just kind of instinctively place the audience around the musicians around the outside, and then plonked the mix position in the middle. I think, you won't mind me saying, that was like the least successful part of the whole show, was the way that we staged it. So after that came out, so a good friend of mine and collaborator, long-time collaborator, Struan, who's just gone off. Is he there? This is your cue. So then we brought Struan in, dramaturge, movement director, to help us think through that in a lot more detail, and help us, you know, really think about how the audience, how attention's drawn to the performers, where the performers go. So Struan, do you want to talk a bit about that now? You have to unmute your mic.
There we go. Hello, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think that one of the things that's important to start with is just to talk about the space of the Albany, in that when you walk into the Albany, you walk into this conventional square foyer space, and then you walk into the theatre itself, and suddenly you're in this, well, it looks like a big top, like a circus big top, but permanent. It's a big oval space with a balcony on the first floor, and then the metal structures come up over the top of the audience, and then, as Dan said, then disappear up into this kind of void in the middle of the space. And so that circular space lends itself, and it's a very flexible space. But for the gig that Dan and Tom were talking about, that you were talking about initially, that there was, the space is completely open, and the intention for this project was that the same thing would happen. There were all sorts of questions for me about where the audience were in relation to the sound. And as Dan said, you know, we're no longer in a proscenium stereo projection space. We're no longer thinking of it in those sorts of terms. So just thinking about the two aspects. One, as Dan says, thinking about where the sound is in the space, and also then thinking about how the audience hear that and how they connect with that. So it was a period of attunement. It felt like we needed to kind of go into some kind of a tuning process, so that when the audience came in, they were thinking about, or they were engaged with the idea of that. So the idea for this project was to build an installation in the space that began to deal with an idea of a horizon, that if you think of the sound being placed around the room, and thinking of that as 360 points around, so that then we can think about projecting the sound. And then with Hannah Mason from Could Be Good as lead kind of visual artist on the project, that we would then use projection as a way of tuning the eye and the ear together. So kind of blurring the boundaries between the senses in that sense, so that we hear the work in a different way because we're seeing something, that's different. So that when we take the balance can then return to then it being sound-led so that the ear goes. And I did some workshops and designed some workshops at the beginning, at the end of last year. And Uta, I remember you saying at the time, well, we all live in a 360-degree world all the time, and we listen in 360 all the time, and that's absolutely right. But from my work in urban design and landscape architecture, just placing the body at the middle of those processes in a conscious way, as opposed to the non-conscious way in which we operate with our 360-degree hearing, but to go actually make that conscious for an audience and also make it conscious for musicians, so that we're not just thinking about the composition as being an end-on process, but actually thinking about it as going, oh, what if I place sound behind me? Or what if it comes from there, or above me, or below me? What does that mean? And I was drawing on all sorts of stuff. So in Shakespeare, he talks about heaven and hell, and that vertical of heaven and hell is very clear within that text. And then in a temporal context, thinking of the future being in front of us and the past being behind us. And so we can evoke senses of place and time through those things. And certainly working with Alex and Rahel and Sam from Hejira, just talking about the trip that they made to Addis Ababa and kind of retracing some family pasts and history, and just thinking about when we started to deconstruct and unpack those tracks that had field recordings in them, thinking about where they were. Were they far away on a horizon, or were they close to us, or where were they? So they can evoke senses of place and time in the way that an architecture or a landscape artist can do in the same way. So that was the process. And so we were asking two questions really. How can we make the space something, a part of the tool for the musician, either when they're writing new music, so someone like Dave Akumu, who's made a lot of new material, or whether you're unpacking material, how do you place in the space? And then for the audience, go asking the question of how do you engage, and where do you stand, and how do we help people to hear, see, and be physically and kinetically engaged in that process?
Thanks. That's a nice segue. I was going to come to Alex next, because Alex of Hejira, I spent probably, out of everyone, all the artists involved, spent probably the most amount of time with you guys.
Sorry about that, Tom.
That's all right. It's over now.
Yeah, you can recover from the traumatic experience.
Yeah. But also, if I compare the way I worked with Dan to the way I compare work with you, we did the most amount of the most radical changes to your material. With Dan, we kept it mostly the same in terms of arrangement and all the voicing and everything. But with what we did, we really reconfigured a lot of the arrangements and added extra things and that. Just firstly, how does that feel as an artist to go back over an album that you feel that's complete and really start messing with it? And then secondly, how did the opportunity to place things in this 360 sort of space environment, how did that make you rethink compositionally what could be done? And
yeah, well, I guess Struan touched on the sort of aspect of the making the record. It was about a journey that we took, Rahel, Sam and myself, to Ethiopia, where her parents are from. And that was in the wake of the death of her father. So it was quite a heavy experience for Rahel, and Sam and I were there sort of as friends and, to emotional support, but also to sort of experience her culture and create music there together. So that journey was very much what we wanted to replicate and try and take people on with us in the space with the initial brief of this sort of spatialized performance in Albany. And so it was nice to unpack our record, Thread of Gold, that came out of that journey. It was nice to unpack the sort of elements from that perhaps we weren't able to fully realize either in the recording studio, and certainly not in a sort of conventional performance kind of live concert situation. The record's comprised of lots of field recordings that Sam took in Addis Ababa, and we really wanted to make that the heart of the performance. So we sort of got rid of quite a lot of the other elements that didn't really feel like they were relevant, and made that the sort of focal point along with Rahel's vocal. And that focus was really interesting. It was, very reductive, the process. We were kind of stripping things out and really only holding on to the sort of bare bones, the sort of essential elements of the music. I was apologizing to you for the sort of famous Hejira indecision that I'm sure Sam, Deacon and Struan can attest to. You had three of us in there, and we're sort of pulling in slightly different directions. But we got to a point where we were really happy with where we're taking the material. And I think the struggle for us when we were thinking about how to perform it was, because we come from a sort of jazz background and improvisation is sort of at the core of how we like to perform. It was, how do you sort of take the pre-recorded sound and then also combine that with an element of chance and improvisation within the performance. And that was really our biggest struggle, I think, in those sessions with you, was sort of finding a formula for that. And we eventually did. But sadly, we haven't been able to realize it yet in a sort of performance.
It was pretty much like the week we cracked it, then the whole world turned upside down, didn't it?
Did you lose me?
No, I think we're good. Yeah. No, I was just saying it was like the week that we kind of landed on a kind of best way forward for combining the playback.
My connections dropped out.
Yeah, then everything just kind of everything turned upside down. But those kind of technical challenges, I think, really informed a lot of the kind of playback sound design that went on. It necessarily had to be really free and kind of floaty and open, and allow you to like all play into it and not have a kind of strict meter. And we kind of, because with Dan, we spent a lot of time and energy really trying to work out how to get all the performers to play to a click and to get them to like really lock into this like strict time signature and groove. Whereas we kind of threw all that out the window, didn't we? Thought it was best to. Well,
yeah, we were kind of resistant to that, although there's a sort of practicality that comes with that, and it's a very different kind of discipline to get good at. I think we were trying to find a way to really bend the rigidity of the pre-recorded sound to sort of allow us some flexibility and for chance and for different performances to happen each time. And that was actually quite challenging.
Yeah, it was. Let's go to Atau and Uta next, I think. Do you guys want to talk a bit about how many iterations you've gone through to get to this point, and but maybe describe the original thought for the Albany show, and then kind of talk about how we had to backtrack and remold it for this?
Sure. Well, for Uta and myself, the project has had several iterations already since it started at the Whitechapel Art Night as a kind of exhibition, an installation. And so then to make it go into a 3D virtual surround projection, and I've got as my virtual background the model for how we had imagined it at the Albany Theatre. Already that was a second iteration of the original concept. Uta's got in her virtual background the blue rocks that are the physical original installation, and each of those rocks has a Genelec speaker in it. So we were doing surround sound, but not we were doing immersive sound, but not in the cinema surround kind of way. The speakers weren't around you. You were walking around in a forest of speakers. So then now to go to YouTube 360 is yet another iteration, but one of the 3D modeled rocks that you see there in this simulation of me performing on stage in the Albany became then the scenography, the dialogue between a human body and a pulsating audio reactive rock. But to back up even further, Uta's original idea was in a place, a natural cave. And so perhaps I'll pass over to Uta to describe the origins of the concept itself.
Yeah, the work started in the Lake District in a huge mine. It was basically the opening towards an old mine. And when there's a lot of rainfall outside, inside the cave, you had these individual raindrops. And I went to record the raindrops inside this massive cave, which in itself was like a surround sound experience, which was phenomenal, like an amphitheater of various drops. And those drops became the basis for the recordings that I passed on to Atau and other musicians, experimental sound artists, for the collaboration at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. So each speaker was connected to a different track. So as you were walking across the speakers, you were having this very different experience of the works that people were composing.
So part of it is then, because when we were, the blue rocks that you see, the sound was immersive. It was a recreation of the natural sounds that Uta had recorded in the cave. And the musicians were sort of in the background remixing them. The rocks, the blue rocks were the sort of the performers, if you may. But with the Albany version, the new iteration for the performance, since there was going to be a stage, since we were in a festival with bands and other performing musicians, was then to bring in what I do with my body sensors and movement. And so this was our first opportunity then to bring together the sounds of nature in the rocks and the water sounds with the muscle interaction that I do. And that I have done spatially before with a set of sensors that amplify the neuron impulse activity of muscle signals. I've had multiple EMG electromyogram sensors around the perimeter of my arm mapped to a quadraphonic sound system on one wall, and having another quadraphonic sound system on another wall. And essentially by creating an 8-channel speaker space going into my body in that sense. So this goes back to a little bit what Struan was saying about bodily presence in space. I perform on stage with a body as musical instrument, creating spatial sound where we enter somehow the performer's body in terms of spatial sound. And in Uta's work, she recorded the space of a cave that was being projected out in a gallery space. And then this was going to be our first opportunity to kind of bring these two ideas together in the Albany. And so now what we've done instead, so there was a real question about how many rocks, how many can we fit in the Albany, and now YouTube 360, how do we then zoom around, how many rocks, and so forth. And so we ended up with this idea of a dialogue, and I just changed now to another background. This is the one rock that you will see in the video, and then this is the one body that you will see in the video. And it has then become a real dialogue between human and nature.
So the rocks for me were always a kind of embodiment of the sound, and I got quite frustrated with the fact that the rocks were not reacting to the sound. So this particular rock is actually reacting to live sound from Atau's performance. So we worked with a programmer who programmed a specific program to teach the rock how to respond to the sound. So it's quite a complex system that we developed. So
that was Vikas Nidvaras, who did programming in Unity, 3D game environment, which we thought, well, since we're going 3D, since we're going 360 video, that kind of development environment seemed like a natural fit. And working with Vitas was what gave us the very advanced audio reactivity that you will hopefully see in the video. But otherwise, it's very simple in that you zoom around, you can zoom into the rock, you can come right up to the surface of the rock, you can check out the details of my gesture. But otherwise, we're not spread out all around the space. But by creating a certain amount of perspective, it does become spatially interesting. And so the mix, Tom, that you've done, I've fed you 8 independent tracks from the 8 muscles, 4 plus 4. To hear this sound come out in the headphone space was, for me this afternoon, magnificent.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, it's almost heartbreaking talking about all this stuff about talking about very immersive audio and stuff existing in this exciting theatre space. But I think it's fine. It's fine. Chris, can we come to you next? I know you've done a fair bit of work in multi-channel systems before. Do you want to talk a bit about the piece that's in this show and some of the work before, and if it's had any previous iterations and on what systems?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm quite new to it, to be honest with you. Like, Dan introduced me to the whole the 360 thing. He was saying, I've got a show coming up. I'd like to get you involved. I really didn't know what to expect. So I just finished an album at that time. So I printed all the stems, and I spent a couple of days with Luke, and it just blew my mind. Luke's got a 360 setup, and just to hear the sounds completely separating, because my sound is very dense, very multi-layered. And instead of actually focusing on the core elements of the music, I ended up taking away the backbone of the music, the thing like the glue that was holding it together. Then suddenly all the incidental sounds became at the front, and this is really interesting. It sort of completely brought the music alive, because I thought, because the music was so dense, it would be difficult to hear with the ambisonics because there'll be too much going on. But it was actually quite the opposite. All of a sudden, these sound sources, which are normally fighting each other, suddenly had their own space to exist in. And then you coupled that with the dub sound system from the Unit 137. You had a really physical low end, and then also like the sort of like you had the body of the bass and then the brain of the ambisonics. So and that just gave me the bug after I did that. Where I work, I'm a university teacher. We've got like a 3D lounge there, and I just got dug in there. And then I got asked to perform the album again at the Lev Music Festival in Madrid just before Christmas. And I collaborated with a 3D animator. So we built a setup where not only would the sounds move in the space, but every time I did any gestures on the mixing console, it would be audio reactive. So certain instruments which are in groups, and when you interact with those instruments, would cause different stereo movements. So you didn't actually know what the performance was going to do, which was really interesting and quite scary as well, because before it was kind of pre-mapped, and then I just did live like dub mixing and effects over the top, which added the element of chance. But his second performance was completely based on chance. And on the visual side as well, we used lots of old Sony CRT television screens with different filters in front of the screens. And there was 3D animation going from these screens, which was then projected onto the wall in the space in Madrid. And that was really interesting. And this performance is interesting because I've done the complete opposite this time, because I was speaking with Dan, and he was saying maybe doing something more rhythmic, because my music is very rhythmic. So it's incredibly dense rhythmically, and I've almost, knowing that it was going to be in 3D and knowing there's going to be more space, I started to make the rhythm sections even more dense than I would in a standard stereo sound. So I'm really curious of how this is actually going to sound. Is it going to sound like complete chaos, or is it going to have that beautiful separation all over again? And I wonder if that physicality is still going to be there as well.
Well, the physicality, no, because most people are going to be consuming this over a phone or laptop or whatever. But the separation, the space seems to transfer pretty well, I think.
Oh, that's great to hear, because I was a bit nervous because it was incredibly dense, because I was going a little bit crazy with it because I'd like dub mixing, and I just went a little bit mad with my delays and my effects lines.
Yeah, no, the 360 video as a container for audio seems to work really well. Struan's got some things to say about the visuals. Good, thanks for bringing up the 3D visual element.
So I was trying to put up a visual, but so one of the things we talked about was the kind of visual dramaturgy of the event, so that this idea of attuning people to the event was was the first step of that. But interesting to hear you, Chris, talking about, working with an animator. And one of the things that we kept talking about was this horizon. So the green screen, I don't know if you can put your visual back up, your design back up. You can see on Atau's visual that there's this green band, this pattern textured band. So this is the installation that we came up with was to build this screen that was like a frieze around the balcony. And originally it just sat at a horizontal, but the decision was made, we made the decision to tilt it. So it kind of just, it meant that in terms of what was moving on the screen would engage you in a different way. So you weren't settled on this horizon. So that when projection started, that would be, if you like, taking you around the 360-degree. Dave Okumu, who's not here this evening, he's made a piece of work about a red moon that he experienced. So one of the images we talked about was floating an orbit of a red moon around this space. Anyway, so the question was, how do we then transition that into this idea of creating a virtual space? And each video starts with a square of light coming towards you, and then it spreads out and becomes a horizon. I'm not giving us, there's no spoilers here, but as each one reveals itself, and you'll see this in the teasers so really well. So for the Friday night teaser, if you go and look at those, folks, you can see them. So you get Dan's strip, and it spreads around, and you can follow it around, and it does create the horizon, and then it tilts. And then Luke, David Harris's comes in, and it does the same. It comes in at the horizon again, opens out, and then it tilts as well. And then Chris's comes in. So we create this space, and then the three of those then merge. So, and then on Friday and Saturday nights, where we see each of the different configurations of musicians, you'll see the same thing. So we create this. So when you are either using your mask, your headset, that you can follow that, and ultimately it fills the inside of this sphere, so that it's as if you're inside a kinesphere. It's as if you're inside the potentials for your movement. And so it moves you, and it initially begins by, as I said, attuning you by you following the visuals. But once you start following the visuals, then you'll find that the visuals then become so extended that what you start doing is listening to the sound. So Hannah developed all the artwork for that. And then we got each of the artists to contribute some video footage or some imagery. Luke filmed stuff locally here in Southeast London. There's some film from Addis Ababa. Imogen had already made a video, and we viewed sections from that. So we kind of those have then got pasted and distorted. David Kumu took some film of him playing, and we've placed those on the horizon and in the space. So we've kind of animated it in a different way. So one of the, I suppose, the USP as a live music event is that we're watching some kind of impression or some way of, and I'm using this words back in my consciousness again, but the idea of illuminating what you're hearing, as opposed to illustrating it. So I just wanted to talk about it. Chris just prompted me to talk about the visuals that you'll see and how those have developed.
I think that, did you talk about Struan, how the original idea was this band, this kind of frieze that went around the outside of the Albany?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's stayed as a really strong visual theme, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure, and that's at the core of it, and so that then as you were standing in the space, the visuals would move, so then you would move with it, and in a way, we're kind of doing the same thing with whether you're holding your phone or whatever you're doing, that you follow it around, and it will open up different. And you'll see. So on Imogen's, there are at one point there are 3 screens with her face on it, and they're at one point they're all the same, and for me, when I'm watching, I'm flicking back and forward between them, and then how it opens into the space. David Kuma, it's the same, just kind of opening out. So yeah, that the installation, if you like, of the space has remained constant. We never actually solved it. I mean, we got very close to going and endless conversations with Uta about how big is it going to be. You know, it was probably going to be like a 2-meter wide frieze that was then suspended from the ceiling on this angle. So it was no minor undertaking to kind of go, how are we going to do it? There was quite a lot of that going on.
Yeah. We never actually reached technical realization with that, did we?
No. Next time.
Imogen, have you seen what happened to your video in these new videos?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I just watched it.
Do you want to talk about any thoughts or feelings you got about that? Seeing a finished video deconstructed and then reconstructed in 3D?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's happened with the music as well, because the music that I offered to the project was all done already, so everything's kind of been deconstructed and then reconstructed. But I think on a kind of personal level, like having the opportunity to enable my music to be, you know, like Struan was saying, made like a landscape or like a building, is quite a magical thing to be echoed back to you as the musician that made it, because it is, I don't know, I can't speak on behalf of all musicians, but when I'm making, I'm world making. That's what I'm trying to do. So to have it kind of, like shown to you, like your creation, like that is quite something. So I was very taken aback when I first watched it. It's amazing. Sure.
Oh, that's good to hear, because there's always a bit of a moment when someone gives you some stuff, you take it, and you know, we didn't interact that much, did we? You basically handed over a bunch of stems very generously and just kind of trusted me to, you know, kind of do what I was going to do with them. But yeah, I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Sorry, go on, Imogen.
No, I was just going to say, I think it was interesting for me. It's been interesting to hear everyone's like first iterations of their ideas, because I was actually brought onto this project quite late, and so I hadn't actually done much planning for the physical space. I mean, I'd heard that there were plans that I'd be put on a podium, which I'm desperately sad didn't actually happen. But you know, and I was really looking forward to working with Struan in terms of performance, because that's been my main focus really in my work, has been to do with my body and how I inhabit the space. But it's just been interesting to think about it, to have that kind of shift in thought when thinking about audience interaction and performance, because a lot of my, you know, ideas of altering audience perception of my performance has been like through my narrative, or through how me individually or with my band like present, rather than kind of honing in the focus between the sound and movement. So yeah, there was a lot of like thoughts, half-formed ideas floating around, but I was kind of brought into the project as, you know, the world was ending. And so yeah, I've kind of only really thought about it in this realm.
Yeah, that's interesting, because we would have spent quite a bit more time together in the studio had you know, had you started a bit earlier. But yeah, it's just kind of the way it was. So maybe on that, I just wanted to get like a general sense of what people think about, like, if this is kind of for the foreseeable future, the way that people are going to consume music is solely online. So how is this like one step forward in terms of presenting stuff? Do we need to continue down the road of, you know, immersive video and immersive audio? Is a flat screen enough? And also, one really tricky nut we've been trying to crack is how to maintain some sense of social event around showing something online. How do we you know, bolt on some kind of platform that allows people to interact and, you know, be there, rather than something that just exists online and people access it, you know, kind of as and when? I'd be interested to hear.
what I think is interesting is that it sets up a series of questions about what is music and what is performance. To some extent, we understand some of the parameters in relation to electronic music development and sonic arts. We know that some of those more avant-garde experiments play within that realm, and we can read them to some extent. So what's been interesting for me with this project and the previous iteration that I was involved in is how, in a different way, because I'm involved in popular music teaching, can you bring people who work in a narrative song form world into asking questions of what really is your relationship with an audience? How do you embody a narrative without having to just be presentational or having to work out where the band stands? And how do you light it? Oh, do we just put some video behind it? You know, some of my teaching is about, so what's your intention? And how can you embody that? So as imagers, we don't always have to illustrate what Struan was saying, but to be in it. Therefore, this seems like it's a really serious series of questions about how do we make that manifest, but also how do we make relationships with audiences, and how can they get inside what we do without describing it? I have none of those answers in any vague way, but I think that that's what's interesting about this and how we could think about being in space, turning it and creating events because you enter space, inhabit it with intention.
Struan?
Look, so working in film, because you know, I guess there's something. Is there an interesting reflection on this time through having worked in film as much as you have? Were you not listening? Or do you not hear me? You're muted.
I was muted, yeah. Yeah, no, I think definitely, there's a large, I think with the way things are going in terms of this is the foreseeable, I think there will be a lot of opportunity. I think people are a lot more willing to try and engage with things like this. I wonder though whether just being at an event and experiencing something in real life, whether that could ever be replaced. It's such a difficult task to take on board. But I think exactly what Simon was saying in terms of like, if it's something that's more abstract and that's part of the experience as well, maybe the two cohabit together. I'm not sure, but yeah, if that answered the question at all.
I
think
I personally think this is great because we're not trying to replace the live experience here. You know, you lot have kind of taken what we had planned and turned it into something, you know, quite abstract and different. And you know, people spend their days scrolling on their phone screens, and I don't think you're going to be able to tear them away from that. You know, home sound systems have become kind of smaller, if not bigger. You know, Sonos systems, single speaker systems. You know, people aren't going to hurry out and buy a multi-channel, you know, ambisonic sound system anytime soon. But yeah, you guys have created something here that that kind of takes people away from the normal kind of scrolling and, you know, quickly viewing a video that they see come up that grabs their attention. You know, this is an event that kind of brings people together at the same time, and it's also an event where they can use their phone and headphones, but there's a different kind of interaction interface to experience this event.
Yeah, I think that's a really key thing. I think one of the things I was kind of the least confident about in, and we all talked about this in like how much, because all of these pieces, this is probably about what we're going to present online is probably about 50% of the material that was made for this show. And we had some quite long conversations about, you know, what can people bear? What will they actually sit down and watch? Because their habits in online use is so throwaway and so transient that people are scrolling, swiping left and right and up and down. And I think they're probably going to likely to spend longer because, you know, everyone's kind of like Struan saying, maybe we're more attuned to consuming this kind of culture online. at the moment. But yeah, I don't know. I think it will take a while to build up enough confidence to put on something that's of any real length, and hope that people will actually sit through the whole thing and consume it in a way that they might do if they went to the cinema or a gig. Or
yeah. Well, I hope to God that we haven't seen the end of live music. But one thing I remember noticing from the first event that we did was having this circle. You know, in a way, it kind of encouraged people a little bit too much to engage with each other and not so much on the music. But that was what part of what made it really nice as well. You know, lots of people who hadn't seen each other for a long time, you know, kind of having to kind of engage with each other because it was within this circular space rather than everybody just facing the same way. You know, I thought that was one of the nice things about it.
Luke, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to talk about how I think one of the key things that I've noticed working in 360 film and conventional film, because I work at both, is that the interesting thing is the way in which people, when the first time they experience with their phone and they move it around with the gyroscope and they kind of experience the space, it's quite different to, I feel like when we from an early age, we kind of understand the rules of cinema, like cinematography, how like you have a tight shot of someone's hands whilst you've got a voiceover and it expands to a wide and things like this. It kind of narrates the story. And when people sit there with their phones, I think often it's quite passive and they expect everything. Whereas when you have this, when you have the movement and you're able to actually, you choose where you're going to go with the device, I think it lends itself better possibly to live performance, because everyone has their own slightly more individualized experience of the piece, and I think that's quite key in today's age.
Atal?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on what Luke said and connect it maybe to what you were saying about narrative, in that when we're in a simpler medium, the narrative can be almost created by what's missing. And people who are listening, it's in their own imagination that they fill in what's missing. And that requires a bit of creative work on the part of the listener. And curiously, the more and more that media technologies get advanced, the more and more we try to fill in all the things that are missing, imagining that we're going to give more of the narrative. But then we leave less missing for the people to fill in themselves. So that's where maybe what Luke was just saying and moving around the phone, suddenly it hit me that you might have loads more, but it's not all there, and you have to go find it. Or I'm just trying to figure out a way to get over this kind of overload, information overload, for sure, Zoom fatigue. So what happens if we get too much narrative? Do we just sort of block everything out? And so how can we start peeling away bits so that people's own imaginations can start to fill things in?
I mean, it's like the ancient, so I was just thinking about theatre, and a lot of the thing that we're talking about is theatre, and Simon was talking about performance, and just that interface between what is performed and what the theatre is really interesting. That's how you talking about that just made me think about, in the ancient Greek plays, you never saw a murder on stage. They were all the blood and guts and gore happened off stage. And that's like a classic horror. We never see it. We only either hear it or we're told about it, or so it engages us in that way. But I was also thinking about that, within the theatrical context, thinking about how the world evolves for us, how we're engaged with it. And you look at some of the stuff that's been streamed, like National Theatre productions of shows, and actually what they've tried to do, it seems, is make a movie as opposed to show us the theatre show. So instead of us sitting in a seat and making our choices about what it is that we want to focus, which is what we naturally do, and it's the same when we go and see a band or we go and see a dance piece, where we are editing for ourselves, where the focus is. And then in great, well-crafted work, we don't have to worry about that. That's beautifully constructed. But here in some of these shows, and particularly some of the shows from the National, it feels like they're trying to make a movie. So they're putting cameras above the stage and all sorts of weird angles that you would never get. And you kind of go, actually, I want to see the play. I want to
indeed,
hear.
I've been to see Shakespeare retransmitted, Ben Whishaw and Hamlet or something. And I think, and I was disturbed by the filmic editing for a while, but then I realized maybe they were trying to make up for the flattening, because it was just on a screen like a film. And so, yeah, there's something about that yeah.
And some of that flattening comes from actually the original product actually not being thinking about space in the same way, so that you're on the stage at the Olivier, for example, here, you kind of go, this is or a thrust at the RSC. You kind of go, if you don't go with what it is your setup is, in the same way as we have here, here's the Albany, here's this frieze, here's this world. How do we insert? How do we perform in that? Ask those questions are really interesting and really dynamic. And that's, I like Tom, I'm like going, there's a little bit of me kind of goes, I don't really want to be here tonight. Don't want to be here talking about it like this. Rather that we were in the room and kind of getting moved around by it.
Yeah, I also think sort of in terms of the future, it's kind of interesting how our habits change so quickly, and obviously people couldn't go out anymore, but we saw like the rise of like live streaming, but it's not quite the same. And I kind of feel like events like this could fill a vacuum, and when things do open up again, I can see these kind of things merging. And also I think people are a lot more receptive to engaging in these kind of events, and the fact that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can bring all these different people together, like we're doing now with Zoom. I can't see why that won't now become a new norm, which will integrate itself into the future, into future live performances.
Hello, everybody in Illinois, by the way.
I think that's interesting, Chris, because I've just how this whole thing's altered like the funding landscape. Like funding is quite often attached to locations, like you have to deliver this thing in London, or we're very interested in non-London based artists, or the artist has to be UK based. But now all of that doesn't really make any difference to anything. You can work with someone. I think one of the good things that will come out of this is the confidence to people to collaborate remotely and across countries, whereas everything was kind of quite geographically bound before. I think that mini lull might mean we're coming to the end. How does everyone feel about that?
Yeah, that was quite nice. Yeah.
Felt quite natural.
Yeah, good. So to wrap up then, I've got to say thanks to the Arts Council, who funded this project and the first iteration of it, and PRS Foundation, who also funded this iteration of the project, and the Albany Theatre, who supported both iterations so far. And I think that is it from all of us. So keep an eye out for the links that will all be sent around to the shows tomorrow and Saturday. And I'll see you all soon.
Do we have a set list?
It will be on the website.
Great. All right. Thanks, Tom, and everyone.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, pleasure to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, well done, everyone. Well done.
Yeah, well done, guys.
Bye.
Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
This one, cheers.